I'm Joe Martino. I'm the founder of Collective Evolution, and essentially what CE is an alternative / conscious media platform. What that means to us is we are looking at news and world events, what's going on in the world, from the standpoint of asking, what does it mean to us as human beings? So for example, people are seeing a lot of crazy stuff going on in the world. There appears to be a lot of chaos. A lot of things are changing. And the political-driven media or the corporate-driven media is providing an establishment point of view or a politically biased point of view. Further to that, it's bringing in a lot of different emotions that's leaving people sort of on edge or in fear or confused about which side to a particular issue they're supposed to be on. So we come in and we kind of strip out all the politics, strip out all the emotion, and strip out all the judgment of what's happening and say, here's what's actually taking place. Where is that going to lead us, and how can we choose a new way of moving forward? So that's kind of the approach conscious media takes to all the different issues that are going on in our world. It's reframing the conversation such that you're actually having a valuable conversation versus one that's politically driven. And the reality of the situation is the UFO topic or the extraterrestrial topic has become such a big, I guess you could say, idea in people's minds, not just because of the natural curiosity that exists and has existed for such a long period of time within people, but the fact of the matter is that topic is now being widely discussed in the mainstream. And when you have mainstream media come out and say, hey, this topic is now something that we're allowed to talk about, this topic is now something that for the first time we're admitting full force, yeah, the Navy has been sort of tracking this whole thing for a little while. All of a sudden, the average person is now saying, oh, I didn't realize this topic was so real. I didn't realize this topic had so much credible evidence. Maybe they're not asking, what else do they know? How much deeper does it go? What does that say about extraterrestrials and who's actually manning these craft? But the point is they're talking about it. And the reality of the situation that we exist at now, which is why alternative media is so important, is that alternative media and other authors and research has been talking about the fact that UFOs exist on record through whistleblowers, documents, and so forth for decades and decades and decades. Everyone knows that, well, people in that space all know that UFOs are real. It took a long time for the mainstream media to finally admit that, yeah, they are in fact real. Why did we wait that long? Why did we wait for the mainstream media to tell us before we finally believed, hey, this is actually happening? The next question that comes with the is the extraterrestrial side of it. Okay, so there's UFOs. Are extraterrestrials inside them? Is that who's manning these craft? Are we going to wait for the mainstream media to tell us that's true, regardless of the fact that we've known for decades that extraterrestrials do man some of those craft? It's our choice.
As the founder and director of a major news organization, what are the biggest surprises that you've seen over the last 3 years? In regards to this issue and the other themes of this film.
Okay. The biggest surprises. All right. It's easy enough. I would say one of the big surprises that we've seen, and it really shouldn't be surprising, but it is still kind of surprising, is the amount that people who are regularly following mainstream media have suddenly lost a gigantic amount of trust in the mainstream media. And part of that you could say is just the current presidency with Trump in there, saying a lot of things that, whether he's right or not, makes people ask questions. Is the media fake? Is the media giving you a different narrative that may or may not be true? And so when you see that a lot of people are suddenly going, I'm ready to look at different perspectives, that's a little bit of a surprising moment, because you're now finally having the opportunity where you can change the conversations, and alternative media is certainly going to give you a very different conversation than the classic sort of political establishment point of view. One of the other big surprises is the appetite for a deeper questioning or a deeper conversation behind what is happening, and specifically how that relates to more of what you might call the non-material or the conscious end of our reality. You hear subjects like, are we living in a simulation? How does our mind really work? Who really are we as humans, right? Where is our reality placed within the fixture of other potential beings out in the galaxy? These are questions that suddenly have become almost like mainstream conversation. And it's a little bit edgy, still. It's not like it's like, hey, everybody's talking about this at the coffee shop. It's more so, a lot of the more mainstream platforms, Joe Rogan, various podcasts and so forth, are starting to have these conversations in a bigger way. And it's become surprising that these fringe topics, specifically the UFO topic, is no longer fringe. And that's something that we've looked at for a long time, saying, the moment UFOs no longer are a fringe topic is the moment we're going to start having conversations that are truly going to begin to reshape the fabric of how our societies function. So the average people see UFOs, on the news, right? All of a sudden it's real. UFOs, we've been tracking them in the sky. And they go, okay, well, were the tinfoil hat people right? What's going on with this subject all of a sudden? Why is there chaos? I'm not even talking about people who may have been into this subject for a long time. The average person looks at this and goes, hold on a second, I have to start rethinking things. And the reality of the situation here is that we have to, when looking at this subject, begin to question, or if you want to say, sort of put on the table or throw out, if you will, the idea of everything we've ever been told or how much ridicule there has been about this subject, because that's been one of the key things. There was campaigns set forth for many, many decades by powerful agencies that stated, we need to ridicule this subject. We need to make fun of people when it comes to this subject so that people don't look into it. When you attack the emotional side of somebody, when you make someone feel stupid, when you make someone feel insecure or self-conscious about talking about something, they're going to do it sort of in the closet. They're going to do it behind closed blinds. They're not going to do it in front of their friends. And so there is not just a information process that has to happen with this whole subject. People actually have to go with the deprogramming of the emotional stuff that has been there, that has stated, you're not allowed to talk about this subject. And they have to become okay with talking about this subject and move past all the programming that stated, you need to feel insecure, you need to feel silly, you need to feel like a fringe outsider just for talking about this stuff. So the reality of the situation is this is a multi-layered unpacking, if you will, for humanity to go through this UFO process and understanding what's actually going on here and what the implications of a extraterrestrial reality, meaning extraterrestrials exist, what that means to the very fabric of how a person's mind, emotions, and reality functions. It's all part and parcel of the picture.
What are some of the obstacles for people having that conversation and reaching that level of understanding, especially from your perspective as someone who's running this alternative news organization?
So now all of a sudden people are going to have obstacles moving into this whole unpacking of the subject, right? Where are they going to go to get the information? Well, there has been purposeful disinformation, and I mean, sure, some of this is going to be up for debate. Is every document that has come out of an agency, is it real? Is part of it counterintelligence? Is part of it, put there just to deceive people? You don't really know entirely, but that's where sort of the discernment process, that's where looking at this subject for an extended period of time and really corroborating different pieces and understanding the core of it will come into play. Now, the challenge is that the mainstream media has put out for such a long period of time. There's going to be, content that is opposing, right, the reality of this subject. So anybody that's going to search this stuff is going to come into a bevy of old and new content that may completely contradict itself. Further to that, they're now going to have to ask the question whether I'm looking at a mainstream media article, video, interview, whatever it might be about this subject, or I'm looking at an alternative media or independent media view about this subject, which one of them is actually providing me a narrative that is true or that is actually grounded in the reality of what's happening? Or are we still perhaps seeing through the mainstream media, now that they're admitting this subject, are they trying to control the conversation once again? Are they trying to say, the track record is they were getting their orders from, intelligence agencies saying, here's how you tell this story. So now all of a sudden, okay, they came out and admitted it, but are they going to tell the story so that nobody gets in trouble behind the scenes, so that nobody has to admit, hey, we've actually been purposefully deceiving you about this? Or are they going to tell the story from the standpoint of, hey, we had to keep it secret and now we're ready to tell you a few things here and there? So people actually have to start overcoming, for the first time, this idea that they can't entirely trust what the mainstream media is going to say on this subject, even now that they're talking about it. And further to that, they have to decide what information is information that feels true, or that is true, or that corroborates with something else. And in the day and age where you have social media, search engines, and the mainstream media, and what you could say are protectors or deciders, we'll say deciders of truth, people are in a position where the war, if you will, for their perception and what they think is true is perhaps at the height that has ever have been in, you could say, even Western culture, right? And then now all of a sudden, where do you actually get the information you need to get? Because you're probably not going to find it on social media. We deal with this all the time, right? You put out something, Facebook's not going to show it to you. Instagram's not going to show it to you, right? YouTube's not going to show it to you. It's going to be a lot harder to find. When you're putting in Google results, are you going to see the list of results that are what they want you to understand about the subject, which really goes back to perhaps what intelligence agencies want you to understand about the subject? Or are you going to see results that are free and open, including everybody's perspective, that you can then draw from? So there's a number of technological, pop culture, and just pure on information obstacles that people are going to have to overcome in moving through this. And the reality of the situation is it's going to be very, very difficult for people to have a complex and nuanced understanding of this whole subject. And it's where people that have been into this for a long period of time, that have a very grounded perspective on it, that are not trying to pick one particular side or one particular extreme as to what this subject is about. Those people are going to be, if you will, aggregators of information that are going to be trusted sources for people to actually unpack this subject.
What do you observe about the way the mainstream media covers this now that they've suddenly switched from ridiculing the subject to treating it with seriousness? Do we take it at face value, or what should we look for when we see them, when we're looking at the mainstream media coverage of this? What do you notice?
Thus far, the mainstream media's coverage of this is, from what I've seen, it appears to be what you can say is on the safe side. And what I mean by that is, first, they have a job to do. Their job is to first speak to the audience that watches mainstream media, meaning they understand that their audience that they've had for a long time, the audience that they may have knowingly or unknowingly been deceiving on the subject for such a long period of time, views the subject as like something that's a little bit out there. So first off, they have to unpack this subject, especially in what you could say are the early days. They have to do it in slow little pieces. So they're going to give little tiny tidbits of what's going on. They're going to play or appear to play stupid on it. Maybe they don't fully understand the subject and they're just being authentic. But the reality of the situation is you're always going to have these small steps. A little bit here, a little bit there, nothing too crazy. Interview, bring on experts that are safe, that are not going to go too deep, right? You're not going to see people who have been long-time researchers in the field who, to the mainstream media, appear as though they're loose cannons. And what I mean by that is not that the person that's researching is saying anything wrong, but that they might say something that might take things a little bit too far, that they may not expect, that they may not be able to provide an explanation to. So far it seems like the mainstream media on this subject is playing it extremely safe, extremely simple, and is slowly trying to see how people are responding to this new idea. And I think that's the reality of kind of like, I don't know if there was a second part to this, but that's pretty much.
How does counterintelligence play into that, if at all, in your opinion?
Right. So if you have counterintelligence in this picture, so let's say you have intelligence agencies or particular people that are interested, so this would be high-level, powerful people who are interested in trying to control this narrative. If they're putting out counterintelligence, if I had to guess, if I was a betting man, I would say that the mainstream media is probably going to have, in their journalists, in their researchers, in their pundits and so forth, they're likely going to have a much more difficult time feeding through and understanding what of that counterintelligence is in fact counterintelligence or what might actually be truthful. Because the reality of the situation is their coverage, their understanding of this subject is very, very new and very, very young. In a lot of ways, they're not experts. And it's not something, this is not a subject that necessarily is a okay, I did some research for a week and I know exactly what's going on in the UFO community, in the UFO space, and the UFO research and everything that sort of has been encapsulated over the many, many, many decades that this information has been coming out. So the mainstream media may have a very difficult time weeding through what is or what isn't counterintelligence, whereas alternative media or experts or authors or researchers who've been in this field for an extended period of time and who probably have also developed a little bit of a gut or intuitive understanding of what's going on is going to have a much easier time sort of seeing what's coming out, seeing what they're trying. Like, for example, my perspective, I see right away when the mainstream media is trying to push something about this subject in a particular light, I know what they're trying to do. I can see when they're trying to play safe, when they're trying to dumb down the message, when they're trying to protect powerful interests while holding back some of the truth. Right? There's no, hey, we came out. Here's the document that shows exactly what the CIA has been doing to control this conversation for years, how they've had relationships with the mainstream media to control this conversation for years. You're likely not going to get that from the mainstream media, whereas from alternative media, you're going to get that.
Let's talk about some of the, just very briefly, some of the bigger things that have happened over the last couple of years that have been really encouraging in this space. So there was the Pentagon releasing that report. There was Rob Bigelow going on 60 Minutes. There were a handful of others. There was the recent Admiral Tom Wilson leak.
A lot of astronauts have spoken out too.
Exactly. So
the Tom Wilson leak was the 13-page document talking about the known origins of UFO craft, the one that they knew for a fact that they were extraterrestrial of origin. Okay.
So, and that's actually, Greer's the one who fucking briefed him on that.
I know. It's Was Steve okay with the fact that that got leaked out?
He was thrilled.
Good. Yeah.
Major validation. I'm sure we'll cover it in his interview.
Yeah.
But seeing these things, seeing Rob Bigelow, seeing the Pentagon thing, do you want to comment on any of these specific examples that we've seen? Because we are going to cite these in the film.
Right.
So, and it's going to be in this first section of the movie. So do you want to sort of, if you feel comfortable doing it, sort of help us introduce some of these things that we're going to review very quickly?
So I'll try something here. You could say a first step to the subject of disclosure is admitting that UFOs are real. What does this mean? I'm not just talking about something that's in the sky that's unidentified. I'm talking about something that's well tracked, well understood, is not coming from just experiencers, but is coming from military or government-related tracking or knowledge of things in the sky that they can come out fully and say, hey, this is something that we have no idea what it is, and it's doing and performing maneuvers that we don't know any technology that exists. So it's clear that this isn't just about experiencers saying, hey, here's an unidentified flying object. This is real stuff. This is credible stuff. That's step one. The second question is, who's manning these objects? Who is inside? Is it remote controlled, like similar to a drone? Is it coming from another country and it's piloted by human beings? Is it coming from perhaps the US's military and they're piloted by humans? Or is it in fact extraterrestrial controlled? So that's ultimately your next question. That's going to also lead to this idea of, well, if it's not controlled by humans or remote controlled, then it must be manned by intelligent beings that we're not aware that exist. That's a very important question. The interesting side to this is that this subject will likely unveil in a slow process if fully controlled by the mainstream media, meaning humanity is open and ready to explore this subject in a much quicker and deeper way than the mainstream media is likely going to cover it, because the mainstream media is all about slow, drip, controlled disclosure of anything, really. So now all of a sudden, you have the opportunity. Humanity's looking at it saying, I have this opportunity to say, do I just listen to what the mainstream media says, or do I pull back and look at what's really out there about this subject, such that you might be able to make the leap from UFOs are real to extraterrestrials involved, and it's not going to take 5 decades for us to have that public admission. And some of the best ways to go about that is to look at certain leaks, certain documents that actually indicate, hey, not only do we know that this particular craft that was crashed and recovered is a UFO, that we don't really know how it functions and how it was built, but that we can identify for sure that this is actually not of Earth or human origin, but this is actually from UFO or extraterrestrial origin. So now we are able to look at the documents that exist, the leaks that exist, and say, what does this information tell us, not just about the UFO subject, but answering that next step question about extraterrestrials? Do we really not know that extraterrestrials, or that, beings from other planets, however you want to frame that, do we really not know that they exist? Or how much information is out there that states we already fully know that too? We might as well start talking about that right now.
I want to now, I want to segue this into, we know that they're real. Now let's get into the deeper conversations.
Right.
In terms of what is their purpose, why has it been kept a secret? Because we have to recap a little bit of that last part of unacknowledged, of why it's been kept a secret. Where I really want to kind of land is giving people the option of personal participation. And what you were saying last night, or maybe it was this morning, about the consciousness piece being the real reason why this is kept a secret. Yeah, there's macroeconomic tyranny and energy and all of that, but it's really the consciousness piece. I know that's a lot of ground to cover.
Sure.
But I want to just let you riff, and then I'll stop you and we'll fill in the gaps.
Okay. When you have an admission, UFOs are real, and you begin to have the extraterrestrial conversation as an obvious next step, there's a question behind that that says, well, hold on. These people over here have been talking about this for a long time, and the mainstream media has only just admitted this now, which really is seen as the mouthpiece for governments, if you really look at it, right? If the government's not admitting it, the mainstream media is kind of seen as this mouthpiece for, if they say it, then you pretty much could agree that the government's probably going to say it, right? So the mainstream media, from a psychological perspective, is saying, this is real, and your government would agree with this, okay? The 2016 election in the United States indicated just how powerful alternative media had become. The mainstream media, for the first time ever, had lost grip completely over enough of the public perception that they no longer could control what people thought and how people acted and what choices they made. Now, this didn't mean that there wasn't still a large piece of the population that was listening to and following what mainstream media said. It meant that there was finally enough of a tipping point that stated, this no longer is the powerhouse that controls public perception. From that stems, oh my God, alternative media is powerful enough that if they want to get something out there, if something can leak, if something can be disclosed and enough people are paying attention to it, we either have to join the conversation, meet them where they're at, and then try and control that conversation, or we give up, say, okay, alternative media sort of is going to be the next thing. But we know the mainstream media is not going to do that, right? So what you have now is a concerted effort between mainstream media, social media platforms, and tech giants to say, let's gain control back of the narratives that we require to make sure that we can control how people think about certain topics, because the reality of the situation is independent and alternative media has become too powerful in giving this information out there. So now we're at this point where mainstream media is working to control that narrative. And you could look at it as their trust is in the tech giants and the social media giants to say, we'll make sure your stuff is put up front on YouTube, on Google, on Facebook, just you keep controlling that narrative, right? So now you have this fear-driven, you have this tight little box of what the UFO and the extraterrestrial subject is really about, how it relates to military, government spending, weapons, all the sort of conversations that are very common in the mainstream that people are going to relate to, that they, okay, I can piece the typical dots together such that now you're able to control the perspective through those already well understood ideas about society. So now all of a sudden you have this question. Do we continue to just sort of follow along with that mainstream media controlled narrative? Or does alternative media have to now say, okay, here's what they're saying, we got to continue to push this envelope, take it a little bit deeper? It's not like the mainstream media woke up one day and decided, hey, we're going to suddenly disclose the UFO conversation to the entire world. What actually happened was alternative media, independent media, and all the researchers involved in this community for many, many, many decades was paving the way for this conversation, and it gained so much steam within the public that the mainstream media had no choice but to talk about it. So the reality is, alternative media is going to continue driving this conversation forward, and the mainstream media is going to continue to try and control that conversation. It's up to people, their consciousness, their choice of what they put their attention to, what they choose to touch, and how they decide to discern within themselves what is now true and what is not true. This whole conversation is a relationship with self at the end of the day. People now need to actually say, there's no longer just an authority figure out there, i.e. mainstream media or government, that's going to always decide for me and tell me what is true. It's not like alternative media or independent media is suddenly now the king of the game and we should put all our attention and all our focus into that. It's, I as a human being have started to understand that I've been deceived about a number of different subjects. It doesn't stop at the UFO conversation. I've been deceived on a number of different subjects, and that awakening is taking place. The question becomes, are we going to become self-responsible, understanding and capable within ourselves of how we're going to navigate these tricky waters ahead? Or are we going to continue to say, all right, I just turned my focus from here to here, and what happens then if they start to go off track, if they start to deceive? So this is really, at the end of the day, an opportunity for humanity to move from the adolescent stage to the adult stage of understanding who they truly are.
All right, let's back up a little bit. There's a bunch of questions to cover. Why has this been kept a secret up until this point? You just said why they were forced to talk about it, but why has this been kept a secret up to this point?
So you asked the question, why has UFOs or extraterrestrials, why has there been so much ridicule? Why has there been so much secrecy? Why has there been such a big cover-up? Now, some of the early, layers to that conversation, sometimes people will throw religion at it. They'll throw, people aren't ready to hear that. Sometimes people will bring in, it affects all aspects of our entire world. The propulsion systems, the technology, how would that impact the way we produce energy on the planet, the way our economies function, right? So you can start to see the socioeconomic factors that all of a sudden start to change. And you go, those are all great points. Those are all great pieces of conversation. But the reality of the situation is beyond that, beyond just the systemic part of it, is this idea that it begins to shake the very fabric of who we think we are and the various stories that we've been told about how we got here and who we are as human beings. All of a sudden, you now have to ask or re-ask those questions. And so the reality of the situation is this is less just about people in the system, in the economy that exists, and more about a consciousness that is shifting. It's more about reshaping the very fabric of how we operate as individuals on this planet. So this subject ultimately, you have multiple aspects of who you are as a human being. You have the mind, which is going to list a whole bunch of things within its database of how it views and understands our reality. And then you have what you might call this intuitive aspect of a human being, where it follows curiosity, it follows gut instincts. It can feel and discern things about our world and what's going on. And so what happens is when you're coming up with new information, the loudest thing in your mind or in your sense of consciousness is often the ego and the mind, yelling at you to say, what you just heard counteracts or contradicts what it is that I know and what I have stored away within my database. So the first step is having to recognize that that pattern is actually taking place, and that what we start learning in terms of new information is going to want to be thrown out by the existing pieces of information that are there. And further to that, it's about realizing that when we learn new information, certain things actually become a little bit uncomfortable, because a lot of how we operate on a daily basis comes from belief systems and comes from programs of how we think our reality is, functions, and should be, all of which are learned behaviors. So as we're unpacking this UFO conversation, which ultimately leads to existential questions as you continue down the path, you have to have the courage, you have to be willing to say, I can no longer allow what everything, because it was a deception, everything that made up my mental archives of what I think this subject is about, I not only have to kind of put that aside for a second, but I have to put aside this sort of emotional, programmed attachment to what I believe about my reality aside. And that's not always an easy thing to do. But again, when you're moving from an adolescent stage as a being to more of an adult, self-responsible stage, it's a necessary part of the process.
That's really good. What do you think is the end game for the way that we are seeing them twist and spin the UFO stuff and control it, and with this very controlled disclosure process that we're seeing?
My honest feeling is that from an end game perspective, for what you could say the elite, the people who have been controlling this narrative for a long period of time through various outlets like mainstream media and so forth, I think they realize the game is up. When I say that, I mean they understand that humans evolve, that perspectives change, that people's understanding of reality does change and does shift over time. So I don't think that they're trying to constantly hide that extraterrestrials are real. I think that it served a purpose for a very long period of time that allowed them to put into place certain pieces of the infrastructure and so forth within the way our societies function, such that they can maintain control not only over the way the world works, but the way people perceive their reality and perceive themselves. And now we're at a point where they realize that's changing. And so now it becomes, how do we tell the UFO story, the extraterrestrial story, in a way that isn't going to reveal that we've sort of had these sort of sinister ideas of why we're controlling this entire time and what this is really about and how we've deceived the public. They want to make sure that they don't get in too much trouble for that, so that people aren't going to rise up and say, well, hold on a second, why would you make that choice for me? I think ultimately that is a big part of the end game.
What are the kinds of obstacles that you're coming up against as you were trying to, give people clarity and shed light on this stuff?
As an independent media organization, i.e., we're not funded by corporations, we don't have establishment connections, we don't have the political bias behind what we do. There are a number of different obstacles that we've been facing ever really since the 2016 election and those campaigns were rolling. We started to realize that social media was no longer going to allow us to reach our people. We started to realize we were going to get shadow banned on places like Reddit, YouTube, Twitter. All of a sudden, us actually gaining a larger audience became really difficult because our content was no longer in front of people. Even with Google search engines, all of a sudden, you're no longer ranking on the first page as a high authority, high trafficked website. Now all of a sudden, it's like you're down in page 3, 4, 5. So obstacles have become, not only can you not reach your audience that you spent years and years and years and years building, well into the millions of people, but you're no longer going to be suggested or recommended content in search engines or places like YouTube. Further to that, you also have efforts to demonetize all of our platforms. So here you are, you're running a company, you've spent years and years and years actually building an audience that loves what you do. And then out of nowhere, for no particular explanation, nothing having to do with breaking community guidelines, doing anything wrong, having copyright strikes, none of that. All of a sudden, YouTube says, guess what? Your content's no longer monetizable. Further to that, Facebook turns around and says, you actually can't monetize any of your videos on our platform, even though a whole bunch of these people doing pretty much the exact same thing can.
The average person who wants to see the stuff, who's getting turned on to the stuff and wants to see it come out properly and feels powerless but wants to help, what do you say to that person on how they can be involved?
Okay.
Like, what do we all watching this film need to do?
Right.
in order to bring about the world that we want to see.
Sure. So there's one little piece I'm going to add in before that, but I got that. And for people who are not privy to how the media works and how expensive it is to create articles, videos, and stuff, everything that goes on behind the scenes in a media company, you don't realize oftentimes how much demonetization completely cuts out the legs that you stand on. When you suddenly go from making, say, $100,000 a month to run your entire operation to 80% of that is cut away at the snap of a fingers because some large tech giant decides, yeah, you're no longer allowed to be demonetized, or you're no longer allowed to be monetized. All of a sudden, it's like, well, how do I pay my staff? How do I do what I need to do? Demonetization efforts are insanely effective at silencing media. Insanely effective, because you now have to rebuild everything that is going to sustain, not just grow, but sustain your company in being able to put out a message on a daily basis. Further to that, people start asking the question, what do I do when I'm sitting at home? I learn that maybe there's a cover-up in the UFO space. Maybe there's stuff that's actually happening, and I don't really know what to do. Does me just learning about this information actually do something? What do I do to help change or impact our world? The most real thing, when it comes down to it at the end of the day, there's two pieces that we focus on heavily at Collective Evolution. First one is changing the conversation. And what that really means is, for years, the conversation of UFOs, just as an example, there's so many other topics we could talk about here, but UFOs has always been a subject of that's fringe, that should be ridiculed, that shouldn't be taken seriously, and it really is all just about a bunch of crazy people with tinfoil hats that are reporting, hey, I saw something in the sky. Who knows what they really saw? When you change the conversation, what that looks like is all of a sudden you start educating yourself about what's actually out there, not what pop culture has stated is the reality of the UFO community, which is just people seeing shaky images and pixelated images in the sky. No, you actually start to realize there's a ton of widely covered documentation on this. There's full-on admissions from accredited individuals that know what they're talking about in this space, whether they're from military, whether they're from NASA or whatever it may be. There's tons and tons of evidence to choose from. When you start changing the conversation, that is the basis for how we explore the UFO subject, as opposed to just what the pop culture has decided to tell you is the case, which is just ridiculing the subject. All of a sudden, you're actually able to affect the way everyday conversations are had about this subject. So now when you're meeting with your friends, when you're talking with family, you're actually having a serious conversation about this, which then reshapes the way collective consciousness actually understands and views this subject, as opposed to holding it down to this primitive state of just, we ridicule the subject. We make fun of this subject. The subject only really belongs in Hollywood movies. By changing the conversation, we bring the subject into reality. We bring the subject into the everyday life, which is where this topic actually belongs. Further to that, the second thing that we do at Collective Evolution is really looking at the subject from a standpoint of not being politically or emotionally tied to what the outcome is of the particular subject. Why is this important? When you become emotionally invested in something to the point where you identify with the reality of something. So for example, if I identify as a particular religion, as a particular identity within how I have to be and how I have to act, you've limited your scope of how you view something or a subject, because you now have a filter which all information passes through and says, well, that doesn't fit my belief system, that doesn't fit my belief system, that doesn't fit my belief system, oh, that does, we can keep that, and so on and so forth. So now all of a sudden we're saying, we got to strip all this stuff away. And we have to look at this subject, and we have to say, without all of the lenses, without all of the filters, without all of the belief systems around what it has to be and how it has to look, what are we actually dealing with? And having the courage to do that within an individual self, to sit there and say, I am going to be completely open to what this subject brings forth, what I didn't know, what I now need to learn, or what I now need to be exposed to, just having the courage to do that is a gigantic step in actually having an open mind on the subject. which is crucially important.
That's good.
That was my favorite one so far.
What is cognitive dissonance? And I assume you'd agree that like the way to break through it is direct personal experience.
Mm-hmm.
Can you talk a bit about that as it relates to this matter? Especially.
Sure. Yeah, UFOs and extraterrestrials.
But also, don't assume that they know what cognitive dissonance is. So phrase it however you want, or define it if you want to use that term.
Through pop culture, media, whatever you want to talk about when it comes to the UFO subject, you might have seen it a certain way. That creates a certain perception of not only what you think is the reality of the UFO subject, i.e. shaky images of objects in the sky that can't really be made out into anything. That might be your view of the UFO reality. Further to that, it might be something that's a joke to you. It might be something that's on the fringe. And so what happens is when someone comes forth and says, hey, here's a government document that not only illustrates that the people who are mentioned in this document, who wrote this document, actually know that, yeah, UFOs have been tracked on radar, that the government's fully aware of certain entities, for example, that they've been interacting with, certain beings they've been interacting with. That document then goes, well, hold on a second, that doesn't line up with the reality of what I think is going on. And so the first thing that happens is I now have this cognitive dissonance. I now have this thing within myself that states, I can't change my perspective because what I already believe contradicts what this document is saying. So this document must be fake. It must be something that's just a joke. Who knows who really put that together? What happens there is there's this process of we're presented with new information. Yet what happens is we don't actually allow that information to be considered by ourselves as serious or as credible because we're holding on tightly, unconsciously, if you will, to something that we already believe. And so the process is, going back to it again, the reality of the situation is we're going to be presented with new information about this subject. And we have to be willing to take what we already think about that subject and cast it aside. Otherwise, we're going to always stay emotionally attached to what we already believe on the subject, not allowing any new information to change our perspective.
Can you just, for people who are uninitiated, can you just define like what counterintelligence is and why the elite might be interested in controlling this disclosure narrative and why they, if you agree, you know, they seem to be pushing it in a very fear-based military sort of direction, and you know, what's your impression on all of that?
Counterintelligence it's like a military tactic, for example, where let's say you have a certain amount of intelligence that needs to be passed around the community of the people all on one side so that they can understand what's going on. But what were to happen if someone's listening to that information? Well, all of a sudden you need to come up with some sort of code, some sort of system within your community that puts out information that throws off the person who might be listening. In this particular case, you have the UFO subject. If you have intelligence agencies that are trying to control the narrative in a particular way, yet at the exact same time, those documents, that information could not only be sniffed by others, but also eventually become public. If those intelligence communities are trying to maintain a particular narrative or potentially trying to confuse people, they might put out information that does just that, confuses people or throws them off what's actually going on. So counterintelligence is an intentional effort to confuse people with information that looks highly credible. That sums up that?
Great.
Okay.
I think, yes, it's really fun.
And then the other part to it was the...
What's the motivation for doing it with this subject matter? Especially with, you know, at least it seems to me and to Greer, they're pushing us into this confrontation with ETs.
For sure.
Yeah.
So why might there be counterintelligence on this topic? I think it breaks down to a couple of key things. First of all, when you're trying to control a narrative about something, usually there has to be some sort of psychological tactic that's used. In this particular case, let's say you have, you know, the government, powerful elite, whoever it might be that is controlling this narrative. If they're able to keep the population in fear, much like they've done for the past couple of decades with the idea of terrorism, right? If there's always a terrorist out to get you. There's always need for protection. There's always need for military. There's always justification for actions that would otherwise be unjustifiable. Further to that, you have an entire business that's built around war. Plenty of people that are able to profit from that entire idea. Well, what happens when the idea of terrorism starts to fall apart? People are starting to realize, you know what? Maybe we shouldn't be policing the world. Maybe there's not really that much of a threat that's actually out there, which you could argue is actually happening amongst the population that's starting to awaken to that reality. Well, now all of a sudden you need a new enemy. And one of the options that could be playing out here is that aliens or extraterrestrials present this new opportunity to say, there's an enemy out there who could be so powerful, who we really know nothing about, who might have weapons beyond anything we possibly have. And they might only be coming to get just the United States or just Western side of the world, but they might be coming to get the whole world. What that starts to justify is not a unification of the globe in what you might see as a harmonious sense. That's a militarized unification and a government unification of the entire globe that states now all of a sudden all military decisions for the entire globe are perhaps made by one set of people, one group of people that can consolidate power from individual countries to now the entire globe, because now we're protecting humanity from extraterrestrials. So what that does is, if you follow the narrative, which is not always so easy for everyone to understand if you haven't looked into it, but if you follow the narrative that there's a powerful group of financial elite that have been keeping control over very, very large subsets of the global population, unbeknownst to what country they're from, you start to realize that the next evolution of that would be to control the entire globe, to control the entire planet. And what better way to do that than to create an enemy in outer space that is coming to get all of humanity? So counterintelligence can be used to achieve that result.
Yeah. So can you help sort of connect the subject matter to like the need to take a pause and learn more about the nature of reality and about ourselves in order to be able to integrate all of this confusing information into a consistent worldview? Again, speaking to someone who's just like, Joe, my mind is blown, there's fucking aliens, but I don't know what to do with this. Right. This doesn't fit into my reality.
Yeah.
You know?
Yeah, I'll try something here and see what happens. All of a sudden the world's presented with this idea that UFOs are real. And that obviously leads to the extraterrestrial conversation. So then you start to think, where did our perception originally come from about UFOs and extraterrestrials? Well, you start looking at, what did we learn in school? What have we been told our entire lives? What has pop culture, movies, and so forth told us about the subject? What has governments talked about? What has mainstream media talked about? When you start unfolding the list, you start to realize there hasn't really been a lot of credible conversation about this that actually looks at something that isn't more than just opinion or ridicule, right? So the reality is the majority of people are walking around very uneducated, not their fault, but very uneducated about this topic. So what starts to happen is, well, you're admitting something that I'm very curious about. I do want to know more about what's going on in space, who's manning these UFOs, are they just military projects? But the reality of this situation is, we also have to figure out where we're going to get that information from. And the challenge is, if there's potentially multiple narratives about what that information is and what's actually true as it relates to this subject, how do you decide which one to go with? So now as you're seeking that information, what happens? We either can view it through the material science point of view, which has stated and told us that evolution is how we got here, and there's probably not any other life in the universe other than perhaps microbes or other bacteria that exist within space. Because really, what can survive out there? That's what we've been told. You also might have the religious point of view, which states that God created humans and put us on the earth and la-di-da, that's that whole narrative, and there's probably not extraterrestrials. Even though there's been some modern admissions that states, well, hey, if there are extraterrestrials, we would be willing to baptize them and welcome them into the religion. Aside from that, those are the two main narratives that we've been fed our entire lives about extraterrestrials. So what actually has to happen when you begin to realize that the new information coming out does not actually line up with either of those explanations, at least at face value? Meaning, sure, maybe within the discussion of the material evolutionary perspective of how we got here, maybe there is an extraterrestrial through line somewhere in there, but it's not obvious. And from the religious point of view, maybe there's an extraterrestrial through line, but it's also not obvious. So now all of a sudden, you're faced with almost this existential thought of, if we're not alone in the universe, which has been a long-asked question, how do we shift our perspective away from these two key worldviews such that they don't become lenses through which we define what is possible for extraterrestrial life? But not only that, how do we become comfortable enough with taking in the extraterrestrial subject that we're willing to actually do it? And not just say, you know what, I'm too afraid to let go of either of these two realities that I might align with. Because that new idea is a little bit threatening to my base reality. So the reality of the situation, people are faced with this subject with having to have the courage to look at either of these two ideas and say, where do they really come from? Are they in fact true? Because the reality of the situation is both are theoretical. And we need to be testing whether or not these theories actually hold up to the reality that we actually know evidentially exists.
That was so good. Can you introduce that segment again and just reiterate it in a different way? Just be like, we have these two competing theoretical models of reality. The scientific model and theological model.
Material science.
Yeah.
That was really good. I just want to have another option.
So would I be able to kind of say that and then it could cut to the other stuff that I had there?
I think so.
Okay. At the end of the day, I don't know how to start these things, so I always throw in something.
That's okay.
We have two competing models, if you will. The scientific model of how we got here and how our world was formed, and the theological model, so the religious side of it. And both of those ideas have become the framework through which the majority of the population has decided not only how our world functions, but who we are and how we got here. But what happens when information suddenly takes those two models and turns them on their head and said, well, hold on, there's now a factor that may or may not fit into either of these models, and that the very framework of these models has to now be re-questioned in order to understand the new evidence that we have about our reality that has never been discussed by either of these models.
That was great. So, next question. What does consciousness have to do with aliens? Does it make any sense? And what is consciousness anyway?
Right, but this is the key. So just give me a little bit of a through line of what you guys intend to land on as the base understanding of how you want to discuss consciousness.
Okay. So we're going to say, look, we got to push pause on the ET thing.
Yeah.
You got to understand the nature of reality and consciousness.
Right.
If we're going to understand ETs and their technology and
Right.
what they are, who they are, and what their intentions are.
Right.
So you guys have to just bear with us while we give you this little lesson on consciousness and physics.
Right.
Where we're going to land on with this is Steve's unpacking of how ET technology actually works. How you don't have to go into this,
Yep.
but essentially how when we take the metal from a crash retrieval, we look at it under a microscope, it's so pure we couldn't build it in a vacuum
Right.
space because it's not being built in a fucking Ford assembly line on Mars. It's
Right.
being manifested out of the fabric of space-time
Yep.
through the consciousness of these super advanced ET Jedi motherfuckers.
So you're willing to go that far?
That's what the movie's about.
Okay.
That's all they shot, and it's like,
Right.
yeah, you kind of have to land
Right.
on
Okay.
that, you know?
Okay.
Do it,
You know?
do it, do it.
All right.
Yeah.
You're going that far.
So that's
Okay.
That's great.
yeah,
Yeah.
that's what the movie's.
Okay.
That's
So let me make an attempt here, and then we can go from
but
there.
you don't have to go into that if you don't want to. It's really about, I need help getting us to that
Yeah,
point.
you need sound bites that help us get there. Okay.
But you should discuss it. I like yours.
The reality of the conversation here is that we sit at this interesting position in time where an evolution in even the scientific understanding of our reality must happen. What does that mean? We're moving from a primarily materialistic view of our reality, which is starting to not be able to explain a ton of things that we're discovering, to a deeper non-material understanding of our reality. When we get into quantum physics, the true nature of things, what is behind the electron? And the reality of the situation is these deeply connect with the UFO phenomenon and the extraterrestrial discussion, because when you start to unpack what involves, for example, crashed craft, for example, how extraterrestrials may interact with their craft, you start realizing that our limited our material view of our world cannot explain the way these things function. So the extraterrestrial phenomenon forces humanity to have to upgrade its long-held limited belief systems within the scientific structure to one that is founded more deeply in post-material science. And without that understanding and that reframing of our reality, you cannot properly understand the extraterrestrial phenomenon. They are intimately linked. And this is why I often say the extraterrestrial phenomenon is deeply linked to the evolution of humanity's understanding of reality and who we are.
Yeah, I know. I love it.
Good. You okay?
It's always the soft spot.
Yeah.
I don't know why, but it just is. I didn't say anything that would be like, oh, why, but it's like, it's just the idea that humans don't know who they are and they're choosing not to know. That's okay. You couldn't tell I was crying, right?
I could tell it was.
This is a great behind the scenes moment.
You're so touched. It's so cute.
This is such a good behind the scenes moment. I had, when we were shooting Steve's interview, I had some really brutal questions based on my deep research. I was going to just lay on him and try to trip him up and make him cry. Or just, I didn't think I could make him cry, but just if I can get like a little lip quiver for a second.
Yeah.
That's all I need. And I didn't have to do any of that. He just fucking broke down, sobbing for 10 minutes. We had to cut it because it was like, okay, it's like fucking 10 minutes. But it was such a raw, authentic moment. Really, like, I developed so much empathy for him.
Yeah, for me, it's the idea that humans have so obviously chosen to be limited in their understanding of themselves, and they don't have to be. They don't have to be limited. Hold on. I gotta get
this. You just stay talking like this, but look at me.
Yeah, and this tone is really good.
It's so much better.
It's conversational.
Okay.
Yeah,
All
it's
right.
so beautiful.
Yeah, for me, it's just the idea that humans have so obviously been limited in the way they perceive themselves, the way they believe the things that they see in their world, who they think they are. And that is so dearly in need of an upgrade. And when I say upgrade, the information's there. The evidence is there. We are not just, material beings living out a reality. And the extraterrestrial discussion is a platform, a springboard into helping humanity truly find. I can't do it. Can't do it. Can't.
This is the heart of the whole film.
Right,
Yeah.
and it's so hard to say because
keep saying, I want people to be in tears. It's so inspiring. And then the next breath he says, and we're going to have wall-to-wall 9 Inch Nails music. The whole film. I'm like, But this is the heart.
Remember where you left off?
yeah, I'm not gonna be able to get it out without crying.
It
It's
is
the reality
so
of the
just
situation.
Do it how you did at the school, where you cry and you just stop and then you just keep
We're
going.
running out of time on this camera.
So that what's amazing about the UFO subject, that it's not just little green man or
Oh,
whatever.
it's a type of consciousness. Why does it really matter?
It's fair that people's interest in the UFO subject is about sort of the sexy stuff, the craft, the different types of beings. Who's really out there? What do they look like? What's that all going to be like? Right? It's fair that that's where people are at. But this subject, and the most inspiring message to me about it, is the fact that this is truly what will bring peace and harmony to humanity. Because it forces us to have to bring in the consciousness conversation. It forces us to have to question who we truly are, what we're truly capable of, and why we're truly here, and who else is here with us. When you begin having the conversation of becoming comfortable with extraterrestrials, and you begin the process, the inevitable process of interaction with those beings, you're going to get a perspective on reality, on life, that is outside of what people see what humanity is. And you start to realize there's so much more to that. And that perspective of what extraterrestrials can bring is like having a population on this side of the world that has no idea that this side of the world even exists. And all of a sudden, these people get on a boat and they come over and they bring a whole new set of ideas, a whole new set of technologies, a whole new way of seeing our world. And it does not have to be violent, and it does not have to be built around war. But it could be built within a love and understanding that truly exists between the interconnectedness that evidentially exists within our reality.
Maybe an easier way to get into it is just quickly, what is the materialist worldview?
Right.
And why do we know it's wrong? Why doesn't science get that it's wrong?
Okay.
And why is it important
Right.
that it's wrong and that we understand how wrong that is?
Right.
So you can just riff on that shit.
Sure. So the materialist point of view when looking at our reality is that all the objects in our world is literally just made out of solid objects, right? Everything that you see, touch, can smell maybe, is real. Anything that you cannot see is not real, is non-existent. Nor do we seem to be interested from the materialistic point of view in truly understanding what exactly is behind all of the material objects that through quantum physics we're understanding appears to be consciousness, appears to be non-solid. And so the materialistic point of view becomes limited in stating that the only thing that is real is solid objects, is things that we can understand through what has become a belief system about what is real in our reality. So the challenge is from the new post-material science that we're starting to understand, when we start looking at quantum physics, when we start looking at the true nature of our reality, the consciousness that exists, the interconnectedness that exists between all objects that appear to be connected in our entire reality. The challenge is that idea does not fit into the materialistic point of view. And so what ends up happening is when you start discovering that that is actual reality, but you're saying, well, that doesn't match my belief system, even though we're measuring that, you're basically accepting that there's a whole other aspect of our reality that we don't want to recognize that exists, nor are we perhaps comfortable with exploring what sort of conclusions might be drawn from that. So the challenge is material science is never going to understand the true nature of our reality, being stuck in viewing our entire world through the belief system that everything is solid.
When you start to break away from the materialist worldview, what does that do to your brain? Like, what does your experience of life become?
Right.
When you expand your worldview to include the reality of consciousness, the reality of other dimensions, the reality of ETs, what kind of world are you living in, Joe Martino?
Right.
You know? What does this do for us?
What kind of world do you want to live in? That's Joe's biggest one.
Yeah, this sort of expansion of consciousness. Well, what does this look like?
it seems as though when we get stuck in this idea of a material reality, we end up thinking that we're a brain, right, in essence, living out a human experience within a body. We're literally just a walking brain that at the moment that brain dies, we're gone and that's it. And what happens with that is that everything, because it's a very limited point of view, everything in our life and our reality, what we believe is possible, what we do, the choices we make, when the very foundation of your beliefs are limited, your consciousness is limited. Thus, the decisions you make, the choices you make, how you function in your daily life often reflects that limited base foundation. Because instead of having a life of full potentiality and an understanding that there is so much potential, you're starting with limitation. So everything in your life becomes limitation. Whereas when you begin to realize that life isn't so limited to this tiny narrow band of possibility and what is, but you start realizing that there's so much more going on, some stuff that we cannot see, that we may not be able to fully measure, but we're starting to measure, you start realizing that your band of what you see as possible in your reality also starts to expand. How that translates in your regular day life begins to affect the choices you make, the relationships you have, the career paths you choose. It starts to make you question, why do we even do things the way we do them? It's an expansion of consciousness that isn't entirely measurable until you actually begin to experience it and have the courage to say, what really is life? How can I expand that? And out of that state of being and out of that state of consciousness births this reality where so much more is possible. And you begin to not be as content, if you will. And it's not like now you're in discontent where it's like, oh, I don't accept this. It just feels like you're ready for something more. You're ready for an evolution. You start feeling like, why do we live in such a limited reality? Why does life have to be this one path of I go to school, I get a job, I live a life with a family, I then die, and that's all it is? When you have a limited, narrow scope of reality, that's how you begin to see life. When all of a sudden your scope of reality expands and you see that there's so much more possibility, you go, well, maybe I don't have to follow that beaten path. Maybe there's so much more that we're capable of. And when you start taking an entire population that expands their consciousness in that manner, you no longer have to sit there worrying about, oh, I got to change mine, but how is everyone else going to change theirs? You start to realize that if I change mine, and everyone's interconnected, and everybody starts to exchange their reality and expand their consciousness, that suddenly all of that material world, if you want to look at it that way, all of the systems and structures of our world begin to naturally reflect the fact that the collective now has an expanded state of being, an expanded view of what's possible in reality. How that translates on a simple level is, instead of just believing, for example, oh, the economy has to function like this and we all need to exchange things in this manner, everything needs to be backed like this and it all needs to happen in this fashion, all of a sudden people are like, well, it doesn't have to be like that. Who said that it has to be that way? Who made that rule up? Where did they get that idea? Why are we all agreeing to that idea? But if all of this is possible, maybe we don't need to play with the system in that way anymore. And so the real life implications of expanding your consciousness comes down to being able to see the very real structures of our reality in a whole new light, where you don't simply accept them for what they are and why they're there, but you say, maybe it doesn't actually have to be that way. Who made this up anyway? What else can we possibly do? When you begin to look at what post-material science, or what you might call the cutting edge of science, is really starting to show us, in that we are all interconnected. That empathetic, connected feeling that you have within you when you see someone on the other side of the planet suffering and you're like, you know what, I may not know exactly what to do about that, but I can feel it. I know what that feels like. I can sense that there's something going on there. When you accept what this science is showing us, that we are all connected, and you then say, well, hold on a second, if we're not just connected with human beings, but we're also connected with the plant life, with the planet itself, with the entire animal kingdom, and you begin to develop that deeper sense of empathy with all that, you begin to ask the question, well, hold on, outside of that reality is the cosmos, is other planets. And who's to say that that interconnectedness doesn't extend to all the other planets, to the cosmos. And that if there are in fact extraterrestrials, that connectedness also exists with them. And if it does in fact exist with them, now all of a sudden we share an intimate interconnectedness based in love or empathy or however you want to define that, a feeling that sort of just radiates the heart, if you will. If we share that with extraterrestrials, what does that world look like? What changes in who we think we are and what we think we're capable of? What would it look like if suddenly we're now interacting with beings that have a whole different perspective on what reality is? How might that solve some of the challenges we face as beings on the planet? And again, we're not trying to solve this through our typical methods of politics, business, and finance, but we're now solving it with a completely different perspective, grounded in the space of what quantum physics is revealing as a oneness or an interconnectedness that exists at the foundational level of all of material.
So can you talk about the mystical tradition, the ancient mystical tradition, or the contemporary mystical tradition, whatever you feel comfortable talking about, and how that sort of subjective, deep spiritual experience of reality is being corroborated by modern science, and theoretical physics, and consciousness research. And we're going to talk about things from a TM perspective a lot, because that's what Greer's protocols are based on. That's what his. So we're going to talk about things like unbounded mind, the Maharishi effect, stuff like that. You don't have to use that terminology. You don't have to talk about those things. However you want to phrase it.
Yeah. Oftentimes, there's this idea that science and spirituality must be separate. And the challenge with this point of view is that you don't actually set yourself up to see the connections that actually do exist between the two. And that really, to have a complete scientific understanding of our reality, you need to be able to witness the post-material. You need to be able to look at it from that point of view. In our past, in our history, people have, and even today, you can even look at it today, people experience, say, meditation, something that they might actually spend a very long period of their life practicing, or perhaps now it's a little easier and people are experiencing the same things within just a couple hours of meditation. But the point is, people will explain through meditation that sometimes they get to this state where it feels as though they were no longer limited to just their body. They felt they were this ginormous presence that expanded outside of even the room they were in, that seemed to lose all form from what we might call form today, i.e. the physical body. And when you're in that state of being, you also begin to notice, observe certain things. You're not in this place of judgment. You're not in a place of worry. You're not in a place of fear. But you feel this unconditional love that just seems to not be able to fit inside your body or to fit inside what you might often define yourself as. And when you begin to recognize that state of being and take a little step over to what cutting edge or post-material science is showing us, which is the interconnectedness that exists in everything in our reality, everything being connected, everything being what you might call a soup of consciousness, you begin to say, well, hold on, that sounds a lot like the meditative experiences that people are having when they shut off the analytical mind and relating to the ego, enough to say, I'm actually tapping into more of who I truly am. That is a direct experience that has often been cast aside as, well, that's anecdotal. But that's something that actually very heavily relates to what post-material science is showing us. So here's a way that we can take what we're seeing in post-material science and actually experience it. And the one thing that's a kicker to this entire thing is then realizing how to take that state of being when you're sort of in the unbound mind and bring that into everyday life. Because if it exists through a practice like meditation, and then you begin to look at What changes when we move from meditation to everyday life? You actually have a reference point to state, well, my mind is engaged, I become very analytical, I start judging and I start looking at all these different things in a particular way. My ego is yelling at me to do this, to do that, to do whatever. And when you start having that reference point and you now can see that those things are often what takes you away from that state of peace, from that state of connectedness with everything, you now have shined a light on something that tells you exactly what you need to do to experience that peace, to experience that infinite potential. That alone, just having the knowledge of what it is that we need to work on, is a gigantic step in expanding our consciousness. It separates us from the mind, from the problems, from the judgment, and suddenly allows us to see it as something that's separate from who we truly are. When you can do that, you can actually begin to solve those things. So with that understanding, the post-material understanding, the direct experience, you say, okay, what do I do? What do I do to shine the light on those things? The reality is you walk out of the theater, you stop watching this movie and you say to yourself, well, if I can start quieting my mind, if I can start practicing, very simply, going into a space, one of the things I tell people to do all the time, carve a little bit of time out for yourself, 30 minutes. Go into a space, put all your distractions aside, and sit and just be with yourself. It can start very simple and it can progress into more complicated practices over time. But when you sit and just be with yourself and you just start to quiet down the thoughts, the patterns, the mind, everything, you start to realize that there's another side to yourself. There's another aspect of yourself that you can explore. In that journey, oftentimes we get intimidated by, oh, the monk, you must be like a monk to be able to meditate like that. Or, oh, you got to do something, you got to spend hours and hours a day. All it really starts with is beginning to break the everyday pattern that you operate within, sort of unconsciously every single day. So now all of a sudden, instead of just, I go from my phone to my car, and then my car, back to my phone, from my phone to my job, in between, back to my phone, get home, go to the TV, but you break that with these moments of time spent with yourself. That space, there's magic that happens in that space where you start to realize, hey, there's something more to myself. I have other ideas. I have other inspirations. I have other feelings that I can explore that are different from the everyday stresses of life. Because when you're constantly doing something to mask what it is that you actually are or what you're actually feeling, you remain unconscious to that. So a very, very first primitive or very just primary step that you can take is just to begin spending more isolated time with yourself and developing a very basic meditation practice that puts you into a space that allows you to begin experiencing what it feels like to move beyond the mind, to move beyond the everyday reality or frequency of mental thought and ego. So you could say that behind this UFO subject is the secret of extraterrestrials. We are not alone in the universe. Could be the greatest secret if you want to stop there. Because you could say, oh, you know, it kind of collapses a little bit of the scientific narrative and it kind of collapses a little bit of the religious narrative, so they're really trying to protect that. But what's really beyond that, what changes humanity from the type of civilization that operates on autopilot, that operates from this what you might call adolescent stage where we look to government, where we look to others to decide for us all the time the direction that we move in our lives and as humanity. It moves us from that state into a state where we are self-responsible individuals because we're beginning to recognize that we've been unconscious to who we truly are. And that's all brought forth by the post-material science, by the direct experience through meditation, by the understanding that we are connected to a greater reality than just what's going on here on Earth. And that is such a highly protected secret because that type of population not only cannot be controlled by force, but they will no longer co-create a reality where there can be an elite that decides the fate of humanity. Because we are now collectively creating an intentional reality, not based in fear and not based in egoic ideas.
Can you talk just a little bit in high-level terms, big picture terms, about how, this stuff has been, up to this point, carefully guarded, we've been back engineering this technology, but it's not being used to solve problems for us and uplift everyone.
Right.
But it's being used for control and greed,
Right.
It's being weaponized, and we're even, if you feel comfortable talking about this part, we've even been using it to shoot down ET crafts.
For sure.
We have pretty good witnesses in the Disclosure Project.
We know there are crash craft. We know that there are technologies that are coming from non-Earth origins that are being reverse engineered in private by various government institutions around the world. What they are doing with that technology is a big question, but it also asks an even bigger question, which is, what is the motivation behind how we as humans, or even this select group of people who are reverse engineering this stuff, what is the motivation behind why or how they're using that technology? Well, if they're using it to control the population, to limit what humanity's capable of from an energy perspective, for example, if they're using that technology as weapons, for reconnaissance, for war, for maintaining control, then that's a use of ET technology that very much matches the way humanity currently thinks and operates, which is from this standpoint of there's me and there's everybody else, and it's all about separation, maintaining control, maintaining power, and maintaining my safety. That's been a state of being that humanity's been in. So how we use these technologies that are coming from ET origins is very much based on what you might call a destructive point of view. So the reality of the situation, when people see, oh, we have these free energy devices, oh, the reality of extraterrestrial technology would collapse, the system's at hand, we need to work on just bringing this information out, bring it forward. If we just told everybody it existed, everything would be changed. Well, hold on a second, because if we just said that the state of being, of how humanity is going to view these technologies, is limited to a separated reality, a separated view of there's me and everybody else, i.e. it's a state of consciousness where we're operating off of autopilot, disconnected from creating a harmonious state on the planet, you better believe that that technology is going to be taken and used for those purposes if everybody knows about it. And so you have to begin to ask the big question. Are these technologies truly meant for a humanity that is operating as a total civilization in a way that doesn't truly understand who we are, but that is also operating on this sort of self-destructive autopilot, i.e. what happens if humanity shifts the way it sees itself? Now all of a sudden we do connect with that interconnectedness that exists between us all, where we move from living primarily through the mind and we start to recognize more of the heart, who we truly are. Does our view and perspective on how we are going to use that technology suddenly change? Do we suddenly see that technology as a way to liberate humanity, solve some of the massive challenges that exist, perhaps remove financial enslavement? Or are we going to do what we've always done, which is use the technology to continue to benefit a small group of people and enslave the rest of the population? So these technologies are inherently tied to how humanity grows from a consciousness perspective. And you could say that it's humanity's consciousness and state of being that is actually holding back bringing forth these technologies, because they're meant to be used in a way that will actually liberate humanity.
What do you think, and this could be based on your personal experience, based on documents that you've read,
Right.
based on combination or whatever, what is your perspective on why ETs are visiting us and what their message is for us?
Whether you take into consideration all of the corroborating stories that are out there, I could take in some of my own experiences. It appears as though the extraterrestrial phenomenon, the message they have for humanity, what their interest with humanity is very much grounded in this idea that if we truly are all interconnected, which realistically our science is showing that, our understandings of how to explore that within ourselves indicates that, So we are all truly connected. If you have one link in the chain that is a little bit weak, that is a little bit broken, and really that chain wants to become really strong to pull something big, right? i.e., it just wants to evolve. It wants to move forward. But there's something that's going to break. All of a sudden, you have to hone in on that chain and say, oh, hey guys, what's going on here? What is this weakness? How might we be able to create an environment that fixes this weakness? And it's not that it's a weakness in that we have to judge it, but we realize, hey, something's stuck here. We need to be shaken up a little bit. The extraterrestrial interest is that for the entire solar system, perhaps the entire universe, to continue to evolve, so does humanity. And if humanity is in a state where we're a little bit asleep, where we've gone a little bit too much on autopilot and our reliance on autopilot is very, very heavy, then the extraterrestrial influence is about saying, how can we remind them that they're on autopilot? Because they're important to the totality of evolving as a solar system, as a universe. So they're here to interact with humanity, not just to start actually doing regular experiences together as a whole, but to say, we need to move through this tough growth process. And we're here to remind people, we're here to open them up that there is something more. And we're here to provide messages and to provide insight, and perhaps at times to intervene a little bit so that there's not full-scale destruction. And we've seen that. So really the extraterrestrial interest is about being sure or assisting humanity. Again, not through a place of judgment, but assisting humanity in this process of understanding and awakening to who it truly is. Because all of our evolutions are tied together. Whether you look at counterintelligence, whether you look at controlling this narrative, whether it be through the mainstream media or anywhere, whether governments come out and say something, you ask, where do we learn the ideas that we need to be afraid of extraterrestrials invading us and so forth? How do those ideas become pop culture? It's been movies. It's been, things perhaps that people say on late night TV shows and so forth. It's this idea that sort of just gets spread around that maybe we need to militarize space to protect ourselves. And where's that coming from? What evidence do we actually have that isn't something that humans do, but that's something that extraterrestrials do? What evidence do we have that states we need to be fearful of extraterrestrials coming in and taking over and destroying the entire planet? We don't really have that evidence. So this idea that we need to actually be afraid comes from a narrative. Then you go to the flip side and you start talking about the greatest secret as to why consciousness, who we truly are, is covered up, is sort of becomes a piece that's on the back burner as we discuss all these other things. Because the reality is that when you start getting into that and you start exploring through meditation, that unboundedness that we actually are, and you get into that state of being where you're no longer just defined by your thoughts and your mind and all the fears and all the worries that you have on a regular basis, but that you're in this space of unconditional love with this unconditional connectedness to everything, you become unstoppable in that state of being. And when I say unstoppable, I'm not talking from an egoic perspective of, oh, I'm going to do anything, I'm going to become the best in the world. I'm talking about you no longer exist within a state of being that can be controlled by others with nefarious ideas. So that state of being is the ultimate antidote to any narrative that states you need to be afraid of extraterrestrials and the extraterrestrial reality. So if we're worried that there's nothing we can do to stop a group of individuals that might be pushing counterintelligence, that might be pushing this alien invasion idea, we're mistaken. Because the reality of the situation is we can create a state of being within ourselves which will extend to the collective that is the ultimate antidote to whatever agendas they might have. And that state of being comes through meditation and shifting our consciousness. In a very basic way, we can look at extraterrestrials in the exact same way we might have looked at a new civilization coming from the other side of the world. Typically, within the human scope of mind, that means war. That means suffering. That means these people come and take over the other people on the other side of the world. But we don't have to look at it that way. We can look at it from all of the great things that came from a group of people coming from one side of the world and meeting with the other. An exchange of information, an exchange of technology, an expansion of language, an expansion of way of life. We start seeing that life was actually not just this narrow band, but there's other people doing something completely different from what we're doing. And now all of a sudden we realize that's possible. And the moment you realize something is possible, it becomes part of the reality. We begin to actually create that. So what happens now if you extend that very same premise to extraterrestrial beings that may come from many civilizations, that may bring ways of life, ways of being, and ways of understanding things, that is going to give us a completely expanded state of what we think is possible. That's what this reality really represents. And within that state of what we think is possible is the ultimate reality that deep within us all, we're seeking peace and harmony within how we can be and how we can live. We're tired. We've grown tired of that reality of disconnectedness, of war, of suffering. It's not even from a place of judgment where we see it as that's wrong. It's from the state of being that says, why are we still doing this? It doesn't have to be that way. And the extraterrestrial conversation leads to a foundation that is that simple.